for joining us here today. Welcome in person and online to New Perspectives on a Changing Climate, Young Voices in Nuclear Energy. My name is Dan Propp. I'm the Senior Special Assistant for Policy at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Tonight, we get to do something interesting, which is we're going to be discussing the future for nuclear power in today's youth-led environmental movement, a movement which was in many ways founded on opposition to nuclear. Back in the 1970s and 80s, a series of incidents involving nuclear reactors and nuclear testing brought thousands to the street in protest of the technology. Here in the US, an environmental movement driven by young people got its wings protesting the events at 3 Mile Island, Rocky Flats, and Chernobyl. And it succeeded. Several states issued moratoriums on nuclear power. And after 1996, the United States didn't bring online a new nuclear reactor for 2 decades. By 2016, only 44% of Americans said they supported nuclear energy. But all that is changing, and fast. In the United States today, support for nuclear power has rebounded to 55%. The completion of the Vogtle Unit 3 reactor in Georgia marks the first new reactor to come online in the United States since 2016, not to mention making Vogtle the largest reactor, or the largest plant in the country. And the United States is now at COP28 calling for a global tripling in nuclear capacity by 2050. And abroad, countries that have historically opposed nuclear are now contemplating an about-face. Despite shutting down its last remaining nuclear plants earlier this year, Germany is embroiled in debate over whether to restart its nuclear industry. Japan is powering up its nuclear reactors after idling the fleet in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. And at the beginning of 2023, nuclear reactors were under construction in 18 different countries, totaling 64 gigawatts of new capacity. This nuclear renaissance is being driven in large part by the urgency of climate change. With the window to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius almost shut, the world desperately needs to meet its growing energy demand with carbon-free sources. Nuclear provides both clean and firm power, so it's an important tool in the toolkit for decarbonizing the energy system, and it's becoming increasingly apparent that it will be nigh on impossible to meet the world's climate goals without some contribution from nuclear. That's why the International Energy Agency, in its net zero emissions pathway, has an 8% contribution, has the world getting 8% of its electricity from nuclear by 2050, more than twofold increase in capacity from today. But if climate change is the motivation, young people are the motivators. Younger generations across the board evince more support for nuclear energy, and they are the driving force behind new organizations like the Good Energy Collective, calling for responsible deployment of nuclear to address the climate crisis. There are still a lot of unanswered questions about the future of nuclear across the supply chain, from mining to generation to waste. The sector has a history of environmental injustice, citing facilities in disadvantaged and minority communities. The United States still has no permanent nuclear waste repository, and cost overruns totaling $17 billion at the Vogtle nuclear plant have cast doubt on the technology's economics. And with 2 nuclear-armed countries now embroiled in active war, nuclear non-proliferation remains a thorny issue. Solving these challenges will be vital to nuclear's future in the clean energy transition, and it will very likely fall to younger generations to come up with solutions. All this is to say we have a very exciting discussion ahead of us. I'm lucky to be joined on stage by 3 leading young experts on this topic. On my left, Dr. Kelsey Green is a postdoctoral researcher at the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the former climate change project chair for the International Youth Nuclear Congress. And she finished her PhD 2 weeks ago.
Thank you.
To her left, Victor Ibarra Jr. is an analyst for the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, where he works on a variety of nuclear innovation projects and leads research and advocacy related to state-level advanced reactor policy and legislation. He's also a master's student in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. And on the far left, Cleo Schroer is a senior policy analyst at the Good Energy Collective, where she works on the intersection of environmental justice and nuclear energy policy. Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, let me say that this event is being webcast live, and a full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, our events are closed captioned. You can turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting show subtitles. So I'd like to start with Kelsey, and we're going to start broad. Do you think that younger generations have a different view of nuclear power than their parents' generations, and why do you think that is?
Yes, so I think that they do, and I think there are some polls that actually show this. So I know that my parents actually, who are in their 60s now, they were anti-nuclear, and I think that's because they grew up in the Cold War. And so they tended to think of nuclear power in relation to the war with the Soviet Union and, having to go under their table, in elementary school to hide from a nuclear bomb or something like that. So I think they had a negative view toward it. And I think the younger generations, though, are much more open to climate or technology neutral options when it comes to solving climate change. And so I think the younger generation is much more open and is much more pro-nuclear than a lot of the older generations have been in the past.
And Cleo, I know you spend a lot of time working on sort of public perceptions of nuclear. Would you agree with that assessment? And do you think the difference in sort of understanding of the threat of nuclear is different across generations?
Yeah, I would agree entirely. I think for a lot of younger generations, a lot of the younger generation as a whole, the big pressing issue that we've grown up with is climate change. And I think that we don't see a possibility of getting to net zero without considering every single technology that we could potentially use to get us to net zero. Nuclear energy definitely has a very rough past, has had its issues. However, at the end of the day, it is a carbon-free source, and we cannot discount carbon-free sources. We just don't have the luxury.
So I gave those two an easy question. I'm going to go to with a really technical one about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been criticized in the past for discouraging public participation in the licensing process with a narrow window of time, high costs for disputing certain projects. At the same time, lowering the bar for public opposition can allow a vocal minority to veto badly needed infrastructure. We've seen that with wind, solar, housing. I guess this is a two-parter. How effective is the NRC's public comment mechanism, and how do you balance the importance of public input against the urgent need for carbon-free power?
Okay, you're gonna have to remind me of the second question in a
Let's come
second.
back to it.
Right. But the first question about how effective the NRC's mechanisms are for public comments and just public opinions being communicated to the federal regulatory agency that's in charge of licensing and overseeing the safety of nuclear facilities, whether it's power production, fuel service, or even potentially what we want to see in the future, which would be either an interim storage site facility or a permanent nuclear repository. They do allow several opportunities, but one conversation that we're having right now in this space is trying to improve the opportunities to include more folks in the opportunity to discuss their hesitancies or maybe their lack of knowledge towards nuclear energy and nuclear power. So there are even federal legislations to create new offices within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission focused on trying to improve public engagement with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But outside of federal legislation and the NRC working itself to help streamline the process to help more people engage at appropriate times in the licensing process for any new nuclear facility. There are new actors actually also trying to take a role in this, whether it's local communities, state governments, really trying to take advantage of what opportunities already exist and regulatory pathways to engage with public comments and public opinions, but also trying to create non-regulatory ways, whether it's engaging through a potential advanced reactor developer who wants to site their nuclear reactor within a community. They start a lot of these conversations early and sometimes can team up with these advanced reactor developers to engage with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on any projects they want to explore. This is kind of a new tipping point from what we've seen in the past where I like to call it the cite and defend model that used to exist in nuclear, where you put a nuclear reactor down and you defend it, and don't give the community opportunity to have a say in what happens with the siting of that reactor. But now new companies are starting to notice that, hey, if we really want to make sure that we either license a new reactor, a new manufacturing facility, a waste repository site, we have to really engage our community. It's super important. And I really appreciate what I've seen so far from companies that we'll probably talk about more as this speaking engagement continues. But, TerraPower, that's a good example of they're trying to start the process of engaging more with communities as they start to site some of their nuclear facilities. But what I'm really excited about is the opportunity to engage even more and really grow on that piece, because the youth, the generation that I'm a part of and that my siblings are a part of, they're very strong and they really want to see change. And they're very upset about what's happening right now in terms of climate and also energy security. And they want to see change, and they want to see change now. So I have a lot of hope for the future, that there is a lot of work to be done. And I really do believe that the next generation, or our current generation, the next generation, with the help of the generation that's already working in this processes, will really help curate that appropriate relationship that we need to have the public engage in licensing new reactors.
So I want to push on that a little more, actually.
Yeah.
Because you said the word streamline.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to know if you think that there is a tension between a robust public comment process and cost-effective nuclear power.
Yeah. So to address that question specifically, I think there is tension, because there is a balance of, and we'll touch a little bit on what you talked about in your opening comments. The US is going to COP28, and they want to triple the amount of nuclear power. Just to give some rough numbers, right? We have 100 operating nuclear reactors. Let's make the math easy. 1 gigawatt each. It's a lot of gigawatts of energy, right? But if we want to triple it, and these new reactors that we're talking about that are typically a little bit smaller in size, not a full gigawatt, maybe half, a third, even as small as 1/1000, that's a lot of new reactors that we need online, right? So when we talk about licensing new reactors, there's a balance, right? Where we don't want to give up safety, because the thing that's most important, right, is making sure that any new nuclear facility that comes online, you appropriately address any safety, safeguards, security, anything related to that, and don't sacrifice it in the name of speed. But at the same time, climate change is real. In Texas, where I was from, 2021, we faced a huge winter storm where we kind of addressed some of the pressing energy security issues that have become a lot more apparent within, me entering the young professional workforce. Kentucky, this past winter, had close to rolling blackouts that would really gone badly for people if their electricity sources were all forced to come offline, right? These are all important things that we have to balance, and there is a tension, to go back to your question. And I really do believe there is an opportunity to, maybe streamline is not the great word to do it, but try to really figure out what is that perfect, or not perfect, but what is that good balance between trying to license new nuclear reactors while also giving communities and the public the opportunity to engage with a federal agency like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or any other stakeholder in that process.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the front end here, licensing a new nuclear reactor. Let's talk about the tail end, and Kelsey's a bit of an expert on this. So when we think about nuclear waste, just give us sort of the broad landscape. What quantities are we talking about? What are the issues involved? What are the challenges that are ahead if we're trying to build out the nuclear fleet?
Sure. Really quick, maybe some participation from the audience here. How many of you know what actually happens when you're done with the nuclear fuel that's in a nuclear reactor? Does anybody know? It's just show of hands, kind of, a little bit. Okay, cool. So I'll just give a very brief explanation of what spent nuclear fuel is. So basically you have your nuclear fuel, right, which goes into your reactor. It's small pellets of uranium about the size of your thumb, all stacked up together encased inside of a metallic rod. And that's your nuclear fuel. And basically every 1.5 or 2 years, that has to come out of the reactor and new fuel has to go back into the reactor. And so initially what happens to the spent nuclear fuel is it's transferred to a spent nuclear fuel pool, which is just water. Water is a really great shield for radiation. So it spends about 5 to 8 years in a spent nuclear fuel pool where it's cooling down. You can actually walk around this pool. You're not going to receive any dose or anything like that from it. Then after about 5 to 8 years, the spent nuclear fuel is transferred to what's called the dry cask storage system. These are very large, barrels or drums. They have multiple layers of shielding in them to make sure that nobody will get any radiation if they actually walk around these drums. So the spent nuclear fuel is encased in that, and that will be left on site on the nuclear power site for about 60 years. After that, America in the past has tried to have a deep geological repository in Yucca Mountain, which did not actually come to fruition, which I'm sure that myself and Cleo can talk about a little bit more later. But that would be where that spent nuclear fuel would stay for 100,000 years or more. So it's just a little bit about nuclear fuel. And then what was the question again? I just wanted to give a brief overview of how much there was. Okay.
How much? And that sounds super easy. What's the issue?
Super easy, yeah. Okay, so, well, maybe as I talk about this, I'll also try to make the argument that I do believe that nuclear waste can actually be seen as an asset of nuclear energy and not necessarily an issue when you're thinking about in terms of a holistic kind of systems, energy systems thinking. But the issue is that it lasts a very long time. So even though the toxicity level of spent nuclear fuel decreases with time, it will still last about 100,000 years. And so I think this brings up a lot of intergenerational justice issues of, is it fair to have your children's children manage spent nuclear fuel? And can you actually protect them from that radiation? So I think that's where a lot of these like justice issues come into perspective. I do think that it's good to kind of have an idea though of how much nuclear waste we actually have. So like was already mentioned, we have about 95 or 100 operating nuclear reactors in America currently. Their average lifespan has been 40 years. So that's a lot of nuclear power. They've been online since the 1960s. So just kind of in your head, think, okay, we've been having, operating nuclear reactors since the 1960s. How much waste do you think that is? Just kind of in your head. The answer is that all of the nuclear waste, if for some reason we were to all put it together at once in one area in America, it would fit on a football field and it would be stacked up to a height of about a third of the height of the Empire State Building. So that's kind of your idea of dealing with nuclear waste and how much you have after, like I said, having 100 reactors in operation for about 40 years. But the reason I had said before why I think it can be an asset is because first off, there has never been a release of radioactivity from nuclear waste from the civilian nuclear power industry. So we have not, the nuclear waste has not been harming anyone. It's been fully contained since the start of the civilian nuclear power industry in America. So that's a pro. If you think about fossil fuels, that waste is completely outsourced to the air. You have pollution, and that also goes to contributing to worsening effects of climate change. So that is not only intergenerational, but that's also international justice issues as well. Second is what I already said, is that a lot of feedback.
But
Okay. I'll just keep talking. Second is that there's not as much as sometimes people might think that there is. And so we already did that exercise of, is it off now? Okay. We already did the exercise of how much, America has produced. So there are manageable amounts of nuclear waste. It's not like it's overflowing and being released into the environment. And third, you have to consider the trade-offs of, if you don't choose nuclear power as a baseload source, you're most likely going to choose, like I said, fossil fuels. And so if you are thinking about intergenerational justice, you have to think about, do I want to provide, a prosperous and abundant and reliable energy to future generations with manageable nuclear waste? Or do I want to provide them with, possibly the prospect of a lot more fossil fuels, and that fossil fuel waste being emitted into the air and into the atmosphere longer than it needs to be? But I think ultimately the question is, do people trust the nuclear industry and do they trust the government to actually safely and properly handle nuclear waste? And especially do the people and communities who would have that, site for a deep geological repository, right, which is supposed to handle fuel for thousands of years, do they actually trust the NRC? Do they trust the United States government? And I think that's where Cleo's research really comes into play.
yeah, well, I was going to go to Cleo next with a very similar question to that. I think the answer for a lot of people is no, they don't trust the industry or the government for very clear reasons. I could run through a few, but I have a feeling that Cleo will. But I wanted to talk about restorative justice. So for past generations, the nuclear industry has essentially a pretty bloody history, particularly for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities in the American Southwest and elsewhere. What does restorative justice look like for these communities, and what is owed by the U.S. government and the companies involved in the industry?
Of course, incredibly important question. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about waste in general as well shortly. But when it comes to restorative justice, I think the first thing is to really take a look at what has been done, because there's not that many eyes on the issue. I think the nuclear industry has benefited from being pretty quiet for a long time after a lot of the accidents that are kind of the industry is known for. it kind of didn't stop taking community engagement seriously, just kind of kept operating its reactors. And that's why a lot of people don't really know much or understand much about nuclear energy, because they kind of took the industry and made it, took the industry back and made it so that it's less transparent. So the fact that, there's 90 to 100 reactors running in the country, that's something that I actually didn't know until like late in my like educational career when I was getting my master's degree in energy policy. It took me a long time to learn that. So I think the first thing when it comes to restorative justice is like just both requiring the industry and also requiring governments to take a look at the issues that they've caused, highlight them, and let people that have been impacted the most be listened to and be heard on these issues and how the communities want to go about solving them. I think one of the most clear examples of this is the Navajo Nation. In the early years of the nuclear industry, a lot of this was defense focused. A lot of this was commercially focused too. There was a huge boom in uranium mining on Navajo lands in the American Southwest, where there's a lot of really big repositories for uranium. On Navajo lands in particular, there were like thousands of mines that were opened up. They were mined. They used labor from indigenous nations that were not properly warned of the risks, which has led to generational impacts on radiation. And the risks were known by the people who were running these mines, but they just didn't inform folks. But this is a current day issue. It's not just highlighting that past. Still to this day, on Navajo lands, there's over 1,000 unremediated mines that are still releasing some types of radiation into the environment. So as a result, we have a really big impetus to move forward in the industry in a way that recognizes its past. And it could look like a lot of things, but it has to be done with communities not only in mind, but at the center of the conversations. So potentially, if there's folks that want to site a reactor or do the kind of work where they're building out nuclear waste facilities, for instance, talking to these communities about maybe pairing these projects, using some of the funding from these projects to help remediate some of the mines, and kind of overhaul the way in which we are looking at justice issues in the nuclear space.
Mm-hmm. And putting restorative justice aside and looking at procedural justice, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the waste issue as well. Do you agree with Kelsey that it can be an asset rather than an issue? What do you see as the sort of the key justice questions here in terms of disposal of nuclear waste?
I think there's a lot there because nuclear waste is a very thorny issue. I think first and foremost, there are futures in which waste can be an asset. I think what is not known by a lot of folks is that nuclear waste can actually be recycled. And that's something that is not done today in the United States, but it's done elsewhere. It's done in France. There's a reprocessing, which is another term for recycling, facility in Russia, and there's one that was just getting built in Japan, although it's not operational yet. And you can take a lot of the waste that was from these reactors, reprocess it into new fuel, use it in reactors again. It has a lot of benefits, both because you're not, having to store a lot of this waste, and also because, pardon me, sorry, a lot of benefits because you're not storing this waste, but also because what is left, the byproducts of that waste, are not radioactive for as long. So it goes from hundreds of thousands of years to potentially only 500 years, which is a lot more manageable from the intergenerational justice standpoint. So recycling is definitely a really important thing to look at when you're looking at kind of whether or not nuclear waste is an asset. But there is the other argument of that there is a lot of money that is in funding for nuclear waste siting facilities. And right now the government is going about trying to figure out, or the United States government is going about trying to figure out how they're going to site, well, first an interim storage facility just to get it out of the reactors where it is now, and then a deep geological repository. There's a lot of money that is ready to go towards communities, and communities have a lot of bargaining power because nobody wants to site a nuclear waste facility. It's something that is really scary for a community to go into. And not only do you have to consider the safety element, but you also have to consider the cultural element of, this is a facility that is going to be sited for centuries. Even the interim storage facility, which the Department of Energy is looking at right now, is going to be sited for probably at least 100 years, probably much longer. So by integrating this type of facility into a community, you're changing the landscape of that community because they are getting shipments of nuclear waste from around the world. They're getting a lot of government funding. So they're able to ask the government for a lot, whether that be investments in local libraries, investments in local infrastructure programs, co-location of other energy facilities. So there's going to be a lot of conversations that have to be had at a community center of how nuclear waste can eventually be an asset. And it does create some generational jobs as well. So, you know, for a long term, for a community, it could be a long-term asset. However, it needs to be done right.
So I'm going to get to Victor in a sec, but I actually want to stay on the waste topic for a moment. So listening to the two of you, I'm hearing that nuclear waste is an opportunity, basically, that a lot of the concerns that people typically have about nuclear waste are maybe not as serious or not as lethal as we would imagine them to be. But I don't think most of the public understands that or thinks about it that way. Kelsey, what do you think is the cause of that disconnect between perception and what you see as reality through your research and your work on the nuclear issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, one, the nuclear industry has not really talked about it in many past decades. So I think that's a big deal. You need to be really transparent about what you're doing. And like what Cleo was saying, like what the risks are and what the possible benefits might be to a community. But the industry just in the past hasn't really engaged with communities. And if you're not in the, nuclear industry, you're not always talking about this, like we like to kind of stay in our own little bubble and not talk to anyone else. And so that's been an issue. And I think that's one place actually where young people are making a really big difference is they're kind of moving outside of the nuclear silo and talking to, clean energy advocates who are non-nuclear or even just to like normal everyday communities, like in coal communities and so forth. And so I think really the industry just has not engaged with people. And that's why it hasn't really been talked about. And that's also why people still kind of might have misconceptions that have been around for like a really long time from popular media and things like that.
Okay, switching gears a little bit here. Victor,
Yeah.
I'm going to cite a UC Berkeley study here, but I think this is what you probably all know to be true, which is there's a lot of nuclear jobs. And UC Berkeley found that on a per gigawatt hour basis, conventional nuclear power supports 0.14 full-time equivalent annual jobs compared to 0.11 for coal and natural gas. Is that a good thing? And how do you balance nuclear's job creation capacity against the simple reality that employing more people to work on something is going to raise project costs?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question and also a timely question. Across the United States, we've actually seen a lot of legislation introduced at the state level and even also passed and signed into law related to, EPA, they're putting out requirements about, pollution control for our coal facilities and other fossil fuel related facilities. It might not make sense to run them in the future. We might have to shut them down, but we need a lot of energy. We're only growing in the sense of our energy needs. But how do we do this in a sustainable manner if there is a city, for example, in the middle of Camarillo, Wyoming, where the major content or the major component of the city is the soon to be retired coal facility. You have to think about how you talk about some of these socioeconomical issues when it comes to labor, how to keep jobs in the city, because if, there is nothing to replace the retiring coal site in Camarillo, Wyoming, there's a lot of difficult questions that the community will have to face in the future. And I believe that is part of the reason why not just Camarillo, Wyoming, but also other communities are at least interested about having a dialogue of what nuclear energy can provide for them in terms of economic opportunities, labor, etc. Another thing that I want to touch on as well, though, is, when we talk about labor, we're not just talking about like the amount of jobs created from operating a nuclear power facility, which, we can point to the stats, say it produces a lot of jobs, etc. But there's also another thing to consider when it comes to trying to do things in a sustainable manner. If you're trying to take advantage of a retiring coal facility, you're also trying to take advantage of transmission rights. There's a whole complex issue when it comes to energy systems that a lot of way smarter people deal with than I do in my day-to-day job. But when you start talking about that, right, you talk about permitting and some of the NEPA reform discussions that have been introduced at the federal level, right? you talk about what incentives can you provide a community or job retraining programs if they want to move forward with the siting of a new facility, whether it's nuclear, wind, or solar. And a lot of discussions about empowering communities, right? Not to pick on wind, I think we definitely need to keep building more wind, more solar. Nuclear is not going to provide 100% of our electricity and energy grids. I think it's going to be a lot lower than what wind and solar will provide in the future. But recently in PJM, they decided not to move forward with a offshore wind project. Whether it's economics based, whether it's community siting based, there is opportunities to empower communities moving forward to make sure that whenever we're having dialogues about what we want to move forward with this project, there's multiple things that we have to look at when it comes to siting these new nuclear facilities and other projects as well. And labor is a big one.
All right, let's talk about Vogtle.
Yeah, great.
For those of you who may not be familiar, Vogtle is the nuclear power plant in Georgia. Unit 3 came online this year after a very long construction process, and I believe Unit 4 is set to come online next year.
Okay. Knock on wood.
Knock on wood. So, Kelsey, I'm going to start with you on this one. The Vogtle reactors went $17 billion over budget, as I said initially. And a lot of that is going to be passed on to ratepayers who could see their monthly bills rise by as much as $9. And that's going to hurt probably a lot of vulnerable Georgians. So the two parts of this question. First, what caused those cost overruns? And second, on the assumption that the next few nuclear power plants that we build in the United States might also experience such cost overruns, what can be done to ensure that those additional costs don't fall on vulnerable consumers?
Okay, yeah. So first, about why did it go so over budget and also over time? I believe it was 7 years longer than it was supposed to come online. It took 7 years longer, which is not great for the industry. So why did that happen? So the DOE, I believe they recently released a report sometime this year about why there were so many cost and schedule overruns. So if you are interested in this, that will go much more in depth into why this happened. But I'll just pick out like 3 main reasons. So the first one is you need to have adequate designs of your power plant done before you actually begin construction. So if you are still kind of licensing things with the NRC, or maybe some of your engineering designs not completely done, and then you're also constructing at the same time, just common sense, that doesn't really make any sense to do. So that's the first one. And this has also been learned from reactors before Vogtle as well, from ones that were built in the 1970s and 1980s as well. So this is a known lesson. The second would be supply chain issues. So if you're unfamiliar with the construction of a nuclear power plant, a lot of components that are in regards to, like safety components, they have to be what's called nuclear grade. And this is done by like standards committees. So basically they go through and they check manufacturing plants to be sure that they can create a nuclear grade component. And a lot of, suppliers and vendors haven't done that for a very long time in America. And so they had issues being able to provide components on time for the reactor to be completed on time. So that was another issue, which might, be remediated in the future if you build future AP1000s, which is the type of reactor that Vogtle Unit 3 and 4 are. So maybe in the future now we have that supply chain done, and hopefully that wouldn't be an issue. But that was one reason why you had all of the cost overruns. And the third would also be lack of quality assurance. So you have to be sure, again, like I said, that they're nuclear grade, but quality assurance goes into every component that goes into a nuclear power plant. So being sure that you have all of these procedures in place and a risk assessment for that in place before beginning actual construction will help to decrease the cost and decrease the time as well. So those are 3 main points. But like I said, the DOE report has a lot more in it too, if you're interested in reading that.
And I'm going to get to the second part of the question.
All right, sorry.
So no, I mean, I think that's a great explanation. But what do we do about it? And it sounds like from what you're saying that the next few plants are probably going to face similar until we start to get better at this, right?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any AP1000s set to be built in America, but Westinghouse does have contracts in China, for instance, and I believe in a few other countries for the AP1000s to be built. So which has already all now been licensed by the NRC as well. So now that they're licensed, now that they know what vendors they can trust and that the supply chain is consistent, I think that will help bring the cost down. But basically, like if you look at past studies, standardization and continuity is really important for keeping on time and on budget reactor projects. So standardization means You build AP1000s here, you build them again over here, then you build it again over here. You're not constantly trying to do different kinds of reactor types. So that's important. And then continuity would just be continuity of, engineering and project delivery and supply chains is really important. There's also some people say that you need innovation in the actual reactor types themselves. So instead of a light water reactor, you should try something like a sodium fast cooled reactor because of its type of design. You might be able to, use less concrete, for instance, have less components for like heat transfer and things like that. So that might also decrease costs, but really standardization and continuity is really important for light water technology.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, I mean, one easy way to put it is we want to get that down that learning curve, right? Solar, wind, all of that was super expensive when it was first starting getting introduced into our energy grids. And now sometimes it's the cheapest thing that we can actually build, right? So that's kind of what we want to see when the newly minted Dr. Green would like to use it, the title, is talking about when we see opportunities for nuclear being a competitive or cost competitive energy source in the future. But there's also a reality that we do have to talk about, that a first of a kind reactor, which was the AP1000 projects in Georgia, and what will be some of the new projects going online in the coming decade, they're going to be more expensive just because it's the first time we're building that supply chain. But really through modularization, through lessons learned, through maybe not using a newly minted NRC licensing process as well, which was part 52, and you can read that in the report, right? You can learn about, or you can consider nuclear energy as a potential viable energy resource when you start talking about how it can really go down those cost curves and become cost competitive.
So actually, can I stick with you on that? So I think if you are a ratepayer in Georgia, you're hearing this and saying, great, in 30, 40 years, this won't be as expensive, my rates will go down. But for the foreseeable future, my rates are going up $9 a month. And do they have any recourses? Is the only hope for them to save on nuclear just for us to get better at nuclear and save costs in the process? Or is there a way to sort of defray those expenses and make sure they don't fall on vulnerable consumers?
Yes, there's so many ways you can take this, honestly. I mean, one, I completely understand why Georgia ratepayers are so upset. They were promised a nuclear reactor to be constructed by a certain date at a certain price, and the nuclear industry honestly failed them. I don't think that's a controversial take to have, even within our industry or even among friends. But there are several opportunities to really try to avoid that. Dr. Green talked a little bit about that already in terms of what can we do from like a design standpoint, from an advanced reactor standpoint, from a licensing standpoint, even a little bit. But there are other opportunities where even the federal government can get involved, right? I think a lot of the reason why the Vogtle plants even stayed open was they actually received a lot of LPO assistance to get reduced rates on their, the reduced interest rates on their loans. And, if you think about what is a nuclear power plant, it's a high capital cost project. You need a lot of money to build it, and then you're going to spend the next 30 years paying that money back until you see a profit. But there are opportunities for the government to get involved and help reduce the burden on a community taking a risk on building a first of a kind reactor, right? Because they are doing a service of taking on the opportunity to say, hey, we need energy. We need it by 2029, 2030. Yeah, let's talk about nuclear. Let's bring it here. Let's have a fair, just conversation about how we can fairly take advantage of any programs and assistance that exist. And that's what we're seeing, right? With some of the advanced reactor demonstration projects that are under the Department of Energy. 1.2, well, about 1.2 on average. I think TerraPower and X Energy, they have different amounts that they're awarded, but they're each given $1 billion to help on the first of a kind costs that will be those new nuclear reactor projects that are cited in Camaro, Wyoming for TerraPower, and the Dow Seadrift project, which is an entire interesting conversation on its own if you want to get there at some point, for those projects, right? Because the reality is they'll be expensive. They'll be really expensive, but through federal incentives and federal programs, we can help reduce and mitigate that risk, and then take advantage of those lessons learned, modularization, to make the second, third little bit cheaper. And then, can't say which end of a kind will be the cheapest, right? We'll eventually get there where we can see nuclear be cost competitive. And we've actually done analysis on this, right? Where even the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's the production tax credit or the investment tax credit, they really help level out the playing field for nuclear. And I think there is also a harsh reality where energy costs are just going up in general, right? Your solar farms, wind farms, all the material associated with that, building a house, right? Concrete, steel, all that stuff, super high after the pandemic. And that's just a reality that we have to face. But there are opportunities, like I said, where federal programs can help out with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had one last point on how to protect ratepayers as well. And that's a policy question more than it is a technical question. And I think a lot of the problems that happened in Georgia, it revolves around the fact that the public had very few opportunities to comment. The Georgia Public Service Commission used to have an Office of Public Participation that got disbanded in the early 2000s. So a lot of the decisions that were made by the PSC to pass these pass this financial burden onto ratepayers, they didn't really have a say in. And I think on top of that, there's been issues in procedural justice in the election of those commissioners. There's actually a recent Supreme Court case that decided that the elections in the past, how they were formatted, was unconstitutional. So I think a really big thing that needs to happen going forward is centering public participation and community needs in the policies around how you're going about financing these projects and how you're going about decision making when things don't go to plan. Who gets to decide whether or not you're actually going to continue on this project and continue increasing the burden on communities? And if it doesn't make sense for the community to have it there, it shouldn't be there. And if the community doesn't want to pay that rate increase that will typically fall on hurt forest ratepayers the most, there needs to be very meaningful mechanisms by which their voices are heard. And not only their voices are heard, but acted upon.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So there were two AP1000s also under construction in South Carolina during the same time that they were under construction in Georgia, but those projects were they were stopped. I don't remember what year it was, but did ratepayers have a say in those ones being stopped? Do you know?
I'm not actually sure.
Okay.
I do know part of that was just an incredible amount of government issues, and
Okay.
I don't quite know enough about the cancellation of those reactors.
Quick tangent, but
It's a good question.
No, that's a great point.
Yeah.
So I want to stay with Cleo on this. Beginning in the 1950s, the United States built a lot of nuclear reactors, nuclear power plants. We sort of built up a nuclear industry, and there were a lot of justice issues associated with it, as we've discussed. Now we seem to be on the verge of a nuclear renaissance, a nuclear rebirth, and could potentially be looking at more nuclear power plants being built in the next couple decades. Why would this time be any different than the past? What has changed over the past 30, 40 years to suggest that justice will be a central concern in this nuclear renaissance?
I think there's a lot to be said there. First and foremost, I think that there is pretty much no future for nuclear unless justice is centered. Not the only reason, I think, economics for one reason, but a lot of the reason that we haven't seen new construction of plants for the last 30 years has been public pushback. It's been public pushback against projects after 3 Mile Island, after Chernobyl. The public has been able to have their voices heard. So if advanced reactor developers are serious about getting their projects on the ground, they really do have to take community engagement seriously from an early stage, or they're just going to get pushback in the same ways that the industry has forever. So I think from first and foremost, the industry is not going to be able to build new reactors without centering at least some justice concerns. And I think in addition to that, there's a very big, there's a bit of a shift in the industry. I think there are a lot of younger folks that are getting interested in nuclear energy as a whole. Younger folks that do have more of a justice mindset, that have grown up with fears of climate change and are really motivated by trying to figure out equitable ways to solve climate change that are in the space. So overall, I think, one other point is that I think that also federal programs right now are very much so moving towards centering justice in energy decisions as well. So Biden's Justice 40 initiative is pushing a lot more resources and funding towards historically marginalized communities, getting a lot of these projects and the benefits of these projects brought onto communities that may have not been able to see those without those initiatives. And there's also been a kind of a shift in the way in which they're funding projects too. So I am currently working on a project that was funded by the Department of Energy on consent-based siting of nuclear waste facilities. And what that means is basically the Department of Energy doesn't know how to go about equitably siting nuclear waste. They've messed it up so many times in so many different ways. They were supposed to start accepting waste in Yucca Mountain in 1997, 1998. But they didn't because they got a lot of community pushback from states. They didn't have the right levels of consent from communities to put this kind of facility there. So in this particular program within the Department of Energy, they've really gone back to square one, trying to figure out exactly how do we go about doing this right, both so we can do it in the first place, because it's really it didn't work the first time when they didn't think about community concerns, but also to do things right. They actually brought on, I think for the first time for a funding opportunity announcement for the Department of Energy, they brought social scientists on to help advocate for environmental justice concerns. Just to the funding opportunity announcement that was announced a little over a year ago now. And from the conversations I've had with folks at DOE, there really is a care to kind of shift at least the ways in which we're managing nuclear waste. And I think that kind of permeates throughout the rest of DOE as well, and that a lot of the folks that are managing these new reactor development projects really do care about this stuff from a deep level. There are some folks still in kind of older industry that potentially may not have the same outlook, but I don't think that those projects are going to be as successful. And I think a lot of the younger folks, a lot of the younger reactor developers kind of know that.
That's really interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is that the precondition to a nuclear renaissance is justice and not the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, I think the nuclear industry in the past has underestimated the ways in which communities know how to make their voices heard, and to really be able to have a nuclear renaissance that actually happens. You really do need to center communities. I mean, this is not just a nuclear problem as well. And I think that's also important, is the types of community opposition are happening in response to absolutely every type of energy facility that is being built right now. Wind in particular, wind farms are getting a lot of pushback from communities, solar in particular as well. So a lot of these energy sources are coming up to the same problem, like without taking community engagement seriously, without building these projects on the terms of the people that are going to have to live with these projects. There are plenty of projects that are getting canceled. There are plenty of examples of where costs increase because they have to spend a ton of time on legal defense around facilities. And so I think for nuclear, but also for the clean energy transition as a whole, justice needs to be centered, or else it's not going to happen as quick as it could.
So there's a lot there.
There is a lot there.
We're running a little bit short of time. So I think now we're going to move into questions from the audience. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But we have Carla here with a microphone. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and she can come to you.
Okay, thank you. I was expecting you would say something about small modular reactors. Lots of things I've read said that this is the future, not great big ones, little ones in numerous, and they are, they're all the same, right? So you've got the economy of scale, you've got the supply line, all the things you've talked about for big reactors. Like, what do you see as the future of small modular reactors? And I know one plant just got closed down. And the other thing I just read about these things, that there's a storage facility in Finland where the Finnish, wouldn't you know, think they've figured out how to do it with big copper cylinders and bentonite clay and cement in a metamorphic rock.
So
could you comment on both of those?
I can comment on the first one if someone wants to take the second one.
I'll take the second one.
Yeah, and then we can just add on. But great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so we didn't touch specifically on SMR technology or small modular reactor technology, just because I think we're just talking about nuclear in general, right? But for those of you who may not be aware of what is the difference between conventional nuclear and advanced nuclear, which we also dub as small modular reactor technology, the difference is great in length. It's using the same basic physics principle, which I don't need to get into. But the promise of these new technologies is the ability to use different forms of either coolant or fuels to really build on their safety case, which, at least in the United States, we've had I believe, a good record of operating our nuclear power plant safety. And also the ability to operate at different characteristics. So one thing that I mentioned briefly in my last comment was there's a project that is set to be deployed in the late 2020s in Texas, my home state. It's the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Project between X Energy and Dow Chemicals, which is a huge chemical company. And the reason why they're moving forward with an advanced nuclear reactor company is because they need the reliability, they need the high temperature heat that can be produced from this new small modular reactor technology types, like what is a high temperature gas reactor, and the pressures of it, right? Because folks like us, we're asking companies, we want you to decarbonize. We want you to produce what you're already producing for us at zero emission or a life cycle of zero emissions as close as possible, right? The consumers are really asking for this. So that's why Dow Chemical was saying, okay, well, if you want to see what this looks like, let's try to see if nuclear is the right fit for us to help decarbonize some of these, what would be a lot more difficult to decarbonize if we're just using either energy storage capacity that really doesn't exist, or renewable technology that really can't help us decarbonize those hard to decarbonize sectors.
And yeah, Claire, do you want to?
Yeah, I can talk about Apollo in a second, but the one other thing I wanted to mention on small modular reactors, I think there's a kind of a saying in the industry that's airplanes, not airports. So right now, a lot of the reactors that have been built historically are kind of built more like airports. They're these massive infrastructure projects that spend years and years like in development. The promise of small modular reactors in the fact that they are modular is that they can be built kind of like you do like an airplane. You have one facility that really knows how to build these and does it over and over and over and over again, which increases the safety of any particular unit. And then those reactors that are built in one site are sent out to locations around the country. So that's the other promise of kind of building it like you would airplanes. But when it comes to the Finland facility for nuclear waste, it seems like a really exciting project. I mean, I think they're just now starting to accept waste and put it underground. I think most of the safety inspections have gone really well. I've kind of taken a lot of time looking at how they cited it and how they went about how they went about doing it properly. And it took a long time. It took decades. But one of the ways in which they were able to go about that in a just and equitable way is talking to communities that already benefit from nuclear power. So it's the facility itself is sited in an area that is historically, I think, that has multiple operating nuclear power plants. They've benefited from this technology through high-paying jobs, through consistent electricity. And I think a lot of those communities really do feel some sense of responsibility for also the negative sides, which is the waste that does come out of the thing that they've been benefiting from. So overall, it seems like there's a good amount of support locally for that project. And it's already in pretty late stages. It's the first one to be built in the world that is going operational. And I think that's something that the United States and other countries that are looking to pursue one of these deep geological repositories really is looking at on how to go about it right. Because it wasn't a perfect process by any means, but they were able to do it a lot quicker than a lot of other countries that have gone out to try to build these waste facilities.
Yeah, I want to give Kelsey a chance to respond to that because I saw her nodding vigorously.
Well, I think the Finland example is just so interesting, and I'm super excited about it. I think they can really pave the way for countries like America to do the same thing. And France is now also looking for a deep geological repository, maybe based on their model. But I also think just about the small modular. reactors. They're exciting not just for the American market, but also for the global market. So they can really help to enable renewables as well. So you can have a lot more flexible, dispatchable power onto the grid, which goes really great with, solar and wind. You also have access to markets that maybe don't need a super large gigawatt, reactor. Maybe they need half that size or less than that. And so that's where micro reactors or small modular reactors can come into play as well. So having a diverse set of reactor technology, I think, is really important for acceptance and adoption of nuclear energy as well. So hopefully those will also get built in the next 10 years or so.
So many reasons.
Yeah, so many reasons.
We have time for a few more questions. Got a couple back there.
So I'm grateful for the question on the small modular reactors because that's kind of where I wanted to get. How do they interact with the central themes of waste and public engagement? And I feel like you touched on that latter element a little bit with the safety component, but I would be grateful if you could, I suppose, address those 2 points specifically.
Yeah. So who wants to start? I can definitely start, but
I can do waste briefly. So when it comes to waste, it does change a little bit of what the conversation is around nuclear waste. A lot of these reactors, if they're using different technology types, do have different waste forms that we don't have comprehensive mechanisms in place right now to manage. That is not meaning it does not mean that there is any particular reason why we should not be still pursuing the deployment of them. But it is important for advanced reactor developers to really think about what they're doing with their waste and kind of build a full life cycle into their plants. I think a really good example of this is a microreactor company called Oklo. They are trying to build a very, very small nuclear reactor. It's called the Aurora power plant. And the first use case for this is to replace diesel generators, especially in hard to reach communities that right now just rely on diesel. So a lot of, Alaskan communities, stuff like that, need some sort of reliable energy. And that wind and solar just doesn't make sense, or is incredibly, you have to overbuild, it's incredibly expensive. But the cool thing about what Oklo is doing with waste is that they've actually built recycling waste into their process for how they are sourcing the fuel for their reactor. So they're planning to actually run their reactors on recycled waste from other from existing reactors. That makes it a little bit cheaper for them because you don't really have to pay for nuclear waste if you want to use it for something productive these days. And it also can decrease some of the stockpiles of nuclear waste that we have. So that's kind of the broad answer is we don't know exactly what waste is going to look like with new reactors. It really is going to depend on what technologies are adopted. It's really going to depend on what technologies are adopted and how people are thinking about managing that waste and whether developers are thinking about that early. But there are a lot of conversations being had to try to make it fit into the broader nuclear fuel cycle and the back end of the fuel cycle that already exists.
good question.
I'll just add on to that actually when you think of advanced reactors, a lot of times people think that means they're actually new technology, but the designs have been around for a long time, since like the 1950s. And even though there's never been a commercial operation of an advanced or generation 4 reactor in the United States, we do have experience with research reactors, such as I think 2 sodium fast-cooled reactors in the United States. So I'm not sure how they dealt with the waste for those. I would imagine though that there are things that you could look up online and see how the Department of Energy actually handled that waste. They probably did that internally, so no public comment or anything like that. But there is experience though with that as well. And I have a couple more tangential comments, but if you wanted to say anything else first.
No, I think in the interest of time, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, just really quickly. The first one is that a lot of advanced reactors use what's called HALEU, or high assay low enriched uranium, which is different than what current light water reactors use. And so before, I think last year, there was no funding domestically to be able to produce that kind of fuel for the reactors. Only Russia actually produced that fuel. But as of November 7th of this month, America has begun domestic production of that fuel. And so I think not only is it important to consider the waste aspects of these advanced reactors, it's also important to establish a domestic production ability for the fuel itself as well. So I just wanted to add that in because I think that's a very exciting development too.
And one last comment, 'cause I know you'd also asked about community engagement around these new reactors. I think as we've kind of has been a consistent theme in the conversation, it's going to be really critical to get community involvement right. But because these operate at different scales, it opens up the door for a lot of different types of communities to have conversations around it. So like these micro reactors, off-grid communities could have conversations about having nuclear in their particular circumstances. And that's something that has never been really accessible before because nuclear has these massive industrial facilities. But again, it's going to be really critical that community engagement works, right?
Yeah.
So I'm being told that that's all the time we have,
no.
unfortunately. But we do have a sort of cocktail hour reception for half an hour after this. So if you have more questions for our speakers, I encourage you to come up to them after this and ask them yourself. But thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the audience for joining. As we mentioned, the full video of this recording, so the full recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event is brought to you by the Women in Energy Initiative at CEGEP, which will host a panel discussion on careers and opportunities in the energy transition. This is happening tomorrow, Wednesday, November 29th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. For a full calendar of upcoming events, visit the Center on Global Energy Policy website. Thank you all for joining me here. Thank you to our speakers. Appreciate you coming. Have a good night, everyone.